and gentlemen, join MythVision's Patreon not only to support us, but there are 72 videos that I did with Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald and Richard Carrier, all on the Patreon, early access. You guys can ask personal questions when I go to interview these scholars, and you're helping MythVision grow. Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald, we have some questions from Dr. Robert M. Price. I asked him to throw them in the bag. He said, okay. First question we have, and we'll just deal with this one video at a time unless for whatever reason we can go. Despite the Jesus story's heavy dependence on Homer, you still think there was a historical Jesus? Do you think it's realistic to think there might have been a historical Odysseus too?
Bob, thanks for your question. No, I don't think there was a historical Odysseus, so we can take care of that one pretty quickly. I'm going to give you an image that I find helpful as a metaphor for understanding how I view the synoptics. I lived in Denver, Colorado for 19 years. And in the winter, we often would have low-hanging clouds. And you couldn't tell that you were in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. You couldn't see any of the peaks. But later in the day, when the sun dried up the clouds, you would see these beautiful white-capped mountains on the Front Range from Long's Peak to Pikes Peak. And in the distance, you would see a number of other layers of mountains, but in the distance, you couldn't be quite sure if they were clouds or if they were snow-capped mountains. But you knew there was a Front Range, and you knew there was a Front Range because the clouds had dissipated and now you had clear skies. Mimesis criticism's virtue is that it can remove the mythical layers that I'm sensitive to and not critical of, but Jesus's memory went through processes of mythologizing, and I know that you agree with that. But the sun comes out with mimesis criticism and it dries up, and you see then other peaks. Not everything in the Gospels by any means can be explained in terms of mythology. So then what's left? What's left is actually very distinctive, Bob, in my view, in many different ways. One is it exposes a different and distinctive social identity, where now the concerns are not Greco-Roman, they're Jewish. Now the intertexts are not Homer and Euripides, but they're Deuteronomy and the Psalter. And furthermore, when you take a look at the mythological layer, Matthew and Luke are always later than Mark. But when you look at this other material, you have this phenomenon of reverse priority. Often, when Mark and Matthew agree with each other, Matthew's version is more primitive. And it's even more spectacular with Luke. Sometimes Luke, though written, I would say 50 years or so after Mark, has primitive material earlier than Mark and earlier than Matthew. Now, these have been recognized by people who try to reconstruct Q, but in my view, they make a mistake in thinking that Luke didn't know Matthew. So you reconstruct Q according to the two-document hypothesis by alternating primitivity. Sometimes Matthew's more primitive and sometimes Luke is more primitive. But if Luke knows Matthew, and I'm sure he did, you can't use that. But reverse priority allows one to reconstruct the Front Range of the Rockies. In other words, there is a lost gospel. And by the way, Luke, when he says in the prologue that many have undertaken to write a narrative of the things that have come before us, he's not talking about two. Two does not make many. Four does make many. And in my opinion, he knows Q, Mark, Matthew, and Papias's exposition. And I know that that's unusual and surely debatable, but that's my view of it. Now, once one looks at this material, it's clear in my view, Bob, that the Q document is not a Christian document. It's not salvation by believing in Jesus' death. Jesus is not raised from the dead. The heavy mythologizing of the synoptic gospels is missing. Jesus is a Jewish teacher who probably loses his life because he challenges traditional Torah enforcers who enforce Torah in such a way that it harms women and the poor and tax collectors and collectively sinners. So I think you get a double whammy from the mythologizing Jesus understanding, because it dissipates the clouds, lets you see the front range. Now, some of the peaks are weaker in their attestation. It's not so clear. And I'm perfectly willing to back off on some of the examples that I think that I would attribute to the Q document. But mimesis criticism and the Q plus Papias hypothesis and social identity theory collaborate with each other to establish that there was in fact a lost gospel. And furthermore, the lost gospel is probably the lost Matthew that Papias refers to, citing the work of the traditions of John the Elder. That is, John the Elder and Papias knew three gospels, one gospel of Mark and two gospels of Matthew that they both thought were translations of Hebrew. So I appreciate your enthusiasm about mimesis criticism. I think you do believe in Q, but I think Q is actually our most important witness to the historical Jesus. It has its own mythologizing. Jesus is the prophet like Moses, and the author has his own agenda. But I think it's reasonable to think that Jesus lost his life because of his challenge to Jewish law, such as we find in Q.
Interesting. So the question bearing on Odysseus' historicity has zero bearing on Jesus' historicity. It's just kind of a template. I think you said before, it's like hero worship, or another way of putting it is we have modern ideas like Elvis Presley and things like that to kind of put onto Jesus. You think this is what's going on with this cult?
Well, I think we have so many examples, Derek, of historical characters getting mythologized. I'll give you some examples. Alexander the Great. No one doubts that there was an Alexander the Great. And we have magnificent, wild mythologies about Alexander the Great that it was already started in the Hellenistic period and continue through the Roman period. We have Apollonius of Tyana, who surely was a real person. And yet we have these wonderful legends about him. We have, I believe that there was a Peter and a Paul. These are real people. What are the apocryphal acts of Paul and Peter? And so this business about mythologizing doesn't mean that the characters that get mythologized themselves are mythical. It rather is that you have historical characters who have thin dossiers, and religious imagination comes along and fills in the gaps, and they do so by these mythological tropes.
Very interesting the way that you phrase that, and it makes a lot of sense if we're willing to say Paul, the acts of Paul. Okay, what do you do with that? Yeah, Peter,
exactly.
The acts of Peter, and going into the other writings of Peter. That's an interesting point. So why are we drawing the line and then go, well, that guy doesn't, but this guy does? And I guess we could say, well, one's actually deified, so there's this next level. But then you can also use deification to show other characters or humans, if you will, that existed were also deified. So,
well, and let's give credit to Bob's question. Bob, it is certainly the case that mythological characters get re-mythologized. So, yes, you can have a mythological Odysseus who gets mythologized over and over and over again, in fact, in Western history. Think of James Joyce and Ulysses and so on. But sometimes this mythologizing happens with historical characters. And I know that, Bob, I know that you know that.
Yeah.
So that would be the analogy that I appeal to.
Thank you.